Thank you for the invitation to present today. This presentation includes a brief overview of the registration process with tips for registration of pesticide products for use against the Varroa mite in hives. The Office of Pesticide Programs is made up of regulatory divisions, science divisions that conduct risk assessments, and support divisions. Varroacide registrations would be submitted to the Registration Division or the Biopesticide Division. Registration is a complicated process because of the statutes. Companies often find it useful to have an agent that knows the process. Also, if it's a foreign company, they will have to have a U.S. agent. In the interest of time, I'm only going to focus on a couple of the statutes. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, gives EPA the authority to register a pesticide if, when used in accordance with the widespread and commonly recognized practice, it generally will not cause unreasonable adverse effects on human health and the environment. FIFRA is a risk-benefit balancing statute. Under FIFRA, the label is the law. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, FFDCA, says that EPA may establish a tolerance, a maximum residue limit on food or feed, if there is reasonable certainty that no harm will result from aggregate exposure to the pesticide residues. Where FIFRA was a risk-benefit statute, FFDCA is a human health-based safety statute that does not consider benefit. If we look at those two statutes, where those two statutes meet, before allowing the use of a pesticide on food, we set a tolerance, which is the amount of a pesticide residue allowed to remain in or on each treated food commodity. The tolerance is the residue level that triggers enforcement actions. If the residues are found above that level, the commodity will be subject to seizure by the government. In setting the tolerance, we must make a safety finding that the pesticide can be used with reasonable certainty of no harm. To make this finding, we consider the toxicity of the pesticide and its breakdown products, how much of the pesticide is applied and how often, how much of the pesticide remains in or on the food by the time it is marketed and prepared, all possible routes of exposure to that pesticide, such as residues on crops, as well as exposure from drinking water and residential exposure, and dietary risk assessments. Since risk is a function of both toxicity and exposure, we then combine information about pesticide exposure to infants, children, and other vulnerable subgroups with information about toxicity to determine potential risks posed by the pesticide residues. If risks are unacceptable, that is, they exceed regulatory levels of concern, we won't approve the tolerances. Some pesticides are exempted from the requirement to have a tolerance. We may grant exemptions in cases where exemption is found to be safe. That is, we must review the toxicity and exposure data the same as for tolerance setting. This is a high-level view of the registration process. It includes submitting forms that tell your use intentions, what you are submitting, your formulation, how data requirements are being met, submission of the data, etc. The Pesticide Registration Improvement Act, or PREA, is a fee-for-service act that created timeframes for completion of registration actions and sets the fee for those actions. You would submit under the appropriate PREA code. Required data are included with the submission. It is important to point out that submission packages need to be complete at the time of submission and that packets are screened to ensure that completeness. Also, biopesticides and conventional pesticides each have different data requirements, so we encourage you to contact the agency early for that determination. Risk and benefit assessments are generated based on data. Risk assessments and risk characterization are reviewed by the risk managers. Label language is then informed by the risk assessment. If no risks of concern are identified based on the proposed use patterns, a risk manager proceeds to develop a decision document for establishing maximum residue limits and any revision to the proposed label. If risks of concern are noted, possible ways to reduce or mitigate those risks to acceptable levels are explored and discussed with the registrant. Benefits of use are also considered in the regulatory decision. Examples of mitigation that may be applied to reduce risk are requiring personal protective equipment, timing of application, decreasing the number of applications, etc. The label is the law. You'll find the following statement on every label. It is a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. The label is the primary tool for EPA to minimize pesticide exposures to mitigate risks of concerns. The label is also how EPA communicates with the end users. The public participation process is applied to registration actions for new active ingredients. For currently registered active ingredients, it would be for the first food use, the first outdoor use, the first residential use, and any registration action determined to be of significant interest to the public. The process allows for public comment on draft risk assessments, impact assessments, labels, and the proposed registration decision. Let's look at some of the data requirements. Product chemistry and acute toxicity data are required for all pesticide products. This includes the active and inert ingredients. First aid statements are determined by the acute six-pack. There are many data requirements for human health and environmental fate and effects. Those are listed in the 40 CFR Part 158 and are based on use patterns for the pesticide. Let's look at some tips for varroacide registration in the context of what I've just presented. In-hive products are typically viewed as food use and will require that a tolerance or an exemption be established. Due to minimal exposure, environmental fate and effects data should be reduced. Whether a product is considered a biopesticide or a conventional chemical will also determine the data requirements and fees. A committee will decide if the registration will be reviewed as a biopesticide or a conventional. It's important to contact the agency early in the product development process to discuss the best path forward for the product with respect to data requirements needed for registration. Reviews of varroacides are expedited. While a foreign registration does not necessarily guarantee a U.S. registration, it may help to expedite the process if reviews of the data can be shared with the agency. An applicant that qualifies as a small business is eligible for a partial waiver of 50% or in some cases even 75% of the registration service fee. This slide is to show differences in review times and fees for the registration process, depending on if you're coming in with a new active ingredient versus a registered active ingredient that would be a new use or a new product. If your research involves screening currently registered active ingredients for varroacide activity, look at the differences here between actions where your registration would be the first food use compared to one where your registration would be an additional food use. There's quite a bit of difference in cost when a food use has already been established. Lastly, if you're looking to improve on how a current registered active ingredient for in-hive use is applied, a new product registration would have the shortest review time in this list and be the least expensive. Information about PREA fees and breakdowns can be found on our website. The list of tolerances and exemptions is compiled in the Code of Federal Regulations, Chapter 40, Part 180. This is useful for looking up if a tolerance or exemption has already been established. For example, if you looked up formic acid, you would find that formic acid is exempt from the requirement of a tolerance for use against tracheal and varroa mites in hives when honey supers are on. If you looked up coumaphos, this is an excerpt of what you would find. What this shows you is that coumaphos is a registered active ingredient, a food use has been established, and a tolerance has been established for honey and honeycomb. The IR4 project is a resource that could possibly help with registration of a varroacide. We suggest that you consult with them because they have interest in and have expressed support for pesticides with in-hive use. We have registration information and guidance available to you online. Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations is where you will find protection of the environment. in which EPA is the regulatory entity. Lastly, as a general rule when pondering whether FDA or EPA would have jurisdiction for registration of your particular product, EPA registers products that target the pest, while FDA targets the disease. This is an oversimplification, but it helps to get you started with contacting an agency. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thank you for your time.